Hi, sorry about that. We got cut off in the middle of that. I was looking at the map, page 136. Um, let's leave the map for a second and just suggest that if you really wanted to take a second with the maps, I would compare the map on page 131, which is the Neo-Assyrian Empire, with the map that I was suggesting on page 136, right? Because it really shows you how much larger the expanse of land that came into the hands of the Persians over what the Assyrians had conquered. So the Assyrians were faced with real challenges, but the Persians were dealing with a much larger, and indeed, because they had penetrated, as we saw in the map, looking at the map all the way deep into in the direction of Asia, they were coming into contact with radically different kinds of people. And the text suggests that ultimately they will create an empire with 70 different ethnic groups in it. And again, this is the challenge. How do you rule people with different languages, different lifestyles, different ways of surviving, right? Different religions, different family organizations, different community organizations, different power structures at the level of the locality. How do you integrate all of these differences into a new society, a new community, a new world order, if you will, right? And so going back again to the reforms of Darius, we said that he suppressed revolts, having conquered from the Indus River Valley as far as the Mediterranean, from the Black Sea down, an immense area. The ultimate final product of this will be a truly immense empire, which proved to be both centralized and multicultural. Centralized in that Darius is going to create a system of governance that respects the differences of culture and religion of different peoples. It will be, and the text uses this term, which I find really interesting, a form of government in which all subject peoples are equal. There is only one real requisite: to give loyalty to the king and demonstrate this loyalty by paying tribute. We might consider it taxes, but they really want it to appear to be a point of honor and not a burden. But, you are giving it to the exalted king. Okay, so to take it further, he's going to create a system of provinces which will has the issue that I've mentioned before, which I really find, from my own point of view, studying these things from the ground up as an anthropologist and looking at it from the top down as the historian, is the whole question of the delegation of power. And understanding how, what can I say, how fragile and rife with the potential for rebellion that the delegation of power implies. I am the king, I am the source, and in many of these different systems that we're looking at, the God, whoever that power in the universe is, however you want to name it, however you want to consider it, conceptualize it, that power in the universe has chosen me to rule in his or its name, to impose law and order on a population. Hence, if you rebel against me, you are rebelling against the powers in the universe itself, right? So when you delegate power, you take what is divinely assigned to you, in theory, and you take part of that power and you hand it over to other people who will rule in your name, but can begin to develop an independent power base. One of the reasons why many of these early empires spend so much time in developing an ideology, a system of ideas that justifies them, but also create monumental architecture, art forms, literature, recordings of history that legitimize who they are and where they came from and who their ancestors were. All of these kinds of things that we're going to see continuing on into Europe in the 17th century. When I was studying Spain and people in the 17th century and into the 18th century, right, the so-called sugar barons and the nouveau riche from the New World would come back to Spain and have someone create a family history for them, a family tree, so that they could claim to be aristocrats, right? They had the money, but they didn't have the blood, they didn't have the ancestry, so they had someone develop a story for them. How different is that from someone like Cyrus the Great, who claims to be the descendant of a legendary king in the past, right? How different is that, right? I worked in Iran while the what's his name, the Shah. Okay, while the Shah was still alive and still in power, right? And who was the Shah? He was the son of a military guy who pulled off a military coup and then created the throne, right? And his son became the Shah, the King of Kings, right? Pahlavi, the Pahlavi throne. Pahlavi throne started with his father, getting the military to back him and throwing out the this kind of a thing. Well, I understand what I'm saying. That still happens today. People will create mythologies to sort of surround them and give them an aura of authenticity and legitimacy, right? Okay, let's see. Let me look at my notes again. Where are we? Okay, so we're talking about the demands on the subjects to pledge loyalty to the king and pay tribute in return. He created systems of provinces with governors. The governor was called a satrap. These were satrapies. They were the person who receives power from the king. Now, again, since I've looked at this through world civilization and a whole host of different examples, who do you trust? This is, after all, the big issue here. When you delegate authority, do you trust that person to remain loyal to you, or do you fear that that person will use the power that you've given them to rule a certain area in your own name, but who do you trust? So very often we will see people going to their own family, right? This is, one of the things that you can do. So Darius chooses relatives or close associates, people that he had dealt with in the military and trusted them. And and yet, even at that, he will have, together with the civilian governor, the satrap, he will also have a military garrison and a military leader who is independent of the satrap, and so is a second power figure there. And in addition to which, what Darius is going to create what many systems of governments have come up with is a system of spies to enable the king, the emperor, to know whether indeed something's going on there, right? And very often, the spies are unknown because, how are you going to have a spy? Unknown to the governors, and they arrive secretly and they observe what's going on, talk to people. Darius is also going to establish a system of fixed taxation, right? And apparently he put together teams of people to try and ensure that the level of tax reflected the the wealth of the particular region and its ability to pay without putting too much pressure on the local population. And again, this is another one of those really tricky areas when it comes to governing. Are taxes what conquest and governance is all about? In other words, is that the ultimate deep-seated reason for getting your fellow tribal members together to go out and conquer so that you can live off the backs of the people that you conquer? But of course, you don't want to break the backs of the people because they will rise up in rebellion and blame you, especially if the governor that you've put in charge of a certain region is extracting so much money, sending me this part and keeping so much more for himself, right? Then the people there are not going to blame the local governor. They're going to blame me because I put him in charge there, right? And so these are, things that had to be worked out, and apparently the Persians were, and the leaders they had from Cyrus to Darius and down the line were wise enough to understand, the implications and the potential downfalls that were inherent in them, right? Now, Darius is also going to be interested in promoting trade. He's going to build roads. He's going to have standardized currency, coinage, standard weights and measures. Now, I just want to stop for a second and think. We've seen in the Indus River Valley how things like standardized systems of weights and measures, currencies, were available throughout a very, very large area for the time, larger in landmass than either Mesopotamia or Egypt had been, and yet there were no clear indications of a sort of a power above, a governing power that could indeed enforce uniformity in that regard. Well, here we see it occurring, right? Okay, so we're looking at something that's 2,000 years later, right? But still, we see the wisdom, if you will, of the Persian rulers that if I have this immense an empire, it would be valuable to have things like standardized weights and measures that everyone could look into, a currency, including coinage, that is sort of controlled by the crown. These are elements that will help promote then the growth of trade, and indeed merchants become valuable figures here, right? Okay, make sure. Change. Okay, this next section in your textbook is talks about Zoroastrianism, which is the ancient religion of Persia, and indeed precedes the arrival of the Persians there, and apparently grew up amongst the indigenous peoples that were sort of further towards the east in the direction of the mountains that separate Persia from Afghanistan. Now, there is this Zoroastrian ideology, system of ideas. But really, there is a Zoroastrian religion of sorts. But we'll get into that in a section, right? But we want to look at this, the text calls Zoroastrianism, ideology, and social structure. Okay, so what is the ideology here? The ideology is an ideology of kingship. This is not the first time we've seen it. We've seen it perhaps best portrayed in Egypt. We will see it in the Zhou dynasty in China coming up with a concept called the mandate of heaven, but let's leave that for a second, right? So we have an ideology of kingship that is built on religious foundations. A little bit like the Code of Hammurabi. The Code of Hammurabi was, chiseled into a piece of black rock, a bright, beautiful black rock, in a column that was then placed, we believe, in the market square that listed the laws that Hammurabi, the king of Babylon, had sort of commissioned his people to sort of develop for him. Why am I mentioning that? Oh, yes. Okay. On that particular rock at the top, on one point, is a carved into the same rock, and sort of at the top is the god who is responsible for the laws, and is in the act of handing over the laws to Hammurabi, which is to say, a clear indication of an ideology that says the laws that seem to be emanating from Hammurabi, the king, are really laws that Hammurabi has received from the hands of God, which is to say, to break the laws of Hammurabi is to break the laws of God himself, and you will face eternal, punishment for that act. Here we have a supreme god by the name of Ahura Mazda, and a little bit like we saw in Assyria, there is this idea, and they had Ashur, a god of a different name and perhaps a different caliber, reflecting the caliber of people that the Assyrians were versus the Persians. But they had a god that sort of placed the Assyrian ruler in power, with the idea that he was to ensure law and order in society and defend society from chaos, right? If people were to diverge from the rule of the Assyrians, right? And a way of having divine forces reinforce the legitimacy of the rulers. We have something similar here, where the belief is that Ahura Mazda, the supreme god of the universe, has appointed the monarch as the ruler over all people and all lands. But there's something here that I think is interesting, that this god, Ahura Mazda, has also, in making him the ruler, has charged him with maintaining a perfect order from which all would benefit. I think that point is really critical because, after the Assyrians, who used a similar kind of idea system to justify their rule had nothing to do with benefiting all people. It was converting the external people to slaves that would sort of provide benefits to people of the interior zone itself, right? And that clear shift between the inner and the outer is something radically different here, tied to that idea that all people who are subject are equal, right? Well, we have here the idea that the ruler should rule to ensure that all benefit from it, right? Um, and I think that the modern mindset is a little bit skeptical of these claims, right? But in any case, there is a religious force behind the throne that is pushing them to sort of respect the traditions, to act in the way that that religious tradition says is the correct way to act. Now, let's go back to the founder, Zoroaster, or Zarathustra, as he's also known, right? Lived somewhere around the year 1000 BC. And what the text says is he, is useful because he crystallized the region's traditional beliefs into a formal religious system. I think he's probably more than that. I think he was a powerful religious leader, sort of like a Buddha-like kind who attracted people from him. And he would preach and they would come and listen to him and this kind of a thing. So he takes the traditional beliefs and out of them constructs, with I'm sure some of his own contributions, a formal religious system, Zoroastrianism, which eventually will become the official religion of the empire. It has its own, shall we say, sacred writings, the Avesta, which came out of an oral tradition, which were written down in about the 6th century BC, and are very much in that regard like the Vedic text of the Aryans that we saw previously when we were looking at the arrival of the Aryans in the Hindu, in the Ganges River Valley, and moving down into India from there. They had their own sacred textbooks too, the Vedic texts that are still part of, shall we say, the Hindu tradition. So going back to Zoroastrianism as a religion, originally it appears to have been monotheistic, right? That Ahura Mazda was the god that created everything. Over time, and perhaps inherently in it, was a second figure, Ahiram, who is sort of the wicked, deceitful aspect, so that Ahura Mazda is the god of goodness. Ahiram is, shall we say, the force of deceit and wickedness. More than, say, a devil, so in the Christian tradition, the rebellion of the angels in their pride against God himself leads to a rebellion in paradise, and angels are thrown out, hence the source of the devil himself. This is different. This is apparently a god with the opposite agenda that Zarathustra is telling his disciples to follow. And indeed, what I find rather fascinating about this is that this is a belief system that sees the universe as dualistic, as potentially divided between the forces of good and the forces of evil. I know that, having been raised certainly a Christian, and that Christians believe that there are forces of evil at work in the world, but there is never the assumption that my actions will threaten the dominance and supremacy of God over the universe, all of which represents his creation, including the devil as well. And the devil who has used the gift of free will to rebel and hence brought upon himself his condition. But again, there's never the sense that other than threatening my own destiny in a next life where I can be punished for my sins, there's never a sense that my actions, if I choose evil, will lead to the ultimate conquest of the universe by the forces of evil. And indeed take over the universe, if you will. This seems to be, yeah, I'm not really an expert in this regard, but seems to be what we have here, a true war, if you will, between the forces of good and the forces of evil for control of the destiny of the universe. So in this case, the Zoroastrian religion has kind of consequences for the individual in a next life where you can be punished for your sins, as we understand it in the Christian religion, but goes beyond that. That my actions, if I choose evil and deceit, reinforce the power of Hiram and push the entire universe in that direction. Which is really kind of amazing that indeed humanity is involved in the struggle for the entire universe and control of the universe, right? Zoroastrianism will go on and claim that humans are capable of choosing between good and evil, which is to say free will. He recognizes a form of free will. And again, these choices have consequences both individually but cosmically as well, right? Now, take this down to the level of the Persian kings then. They enjoyed absolute authority, but at the same time, they are sort of in this religious context, they must follow the moral and political guidelines that reflect Zoroastrian notions of ethical behavior, right? As I said, when we look at the Zhou dynasty, and it's coming up very quickly, right? The Zhou dynasty and then get on to the Han dynasty, we have the concept of the mandate of heaven, where indeed, even though we're looking at ancestor worship, but we're looking at powerful spiritual figures who indeed choose individuals to serve as the rulers, so that the Emperor of China, as we've seen with a host of other ruling figures in a variety of settings in different societies, the Emperor of China also claims, shall we say, a degree of divine, heavenly approval or disapproval. And so we'll look at the mandate of heaven. It's an interesting concept in a bit, but it sort of fits in here, right? Now, going back to the society that's going to be created in the Persian Empire, the text suggests that there are 4 levels of the ruling, of the social order. And so there's a ruling class, followed by an administrative commercial class, followed by 2 groups of laborers, artisans, and the great mass of peasants in the countryside. And in looking at the first one, the ruling class, we have priests in the temples, mirroring what we saw in Mesopotamia, also in Egypt as well, right? We have warriors, because indeed this is a warrior society. Again, and as I suggested with the Assyrians, warfare is coming more and more to the fore as a dominant aspect of civilization. And I ask you quite honestly the question about taxes, because taxes are the way that the government has of extracting wealth from the population. The question then becomes, at what point do taxes constitute exploitation? And to what point do taxes represent the responsibility of the citizen to help pay for services provided by the government, from which the citizen then benefits, right? And you sort of have a balance back and forth, right? And we face that kind of dilemma here in our own society, right? Now, the Persian Empire is going to develop a powerful hereditary nobility, together with wealthy merchants, and the emperor must rely on them. Remember, the emperor, with all of the trappings of empire, is still a single individual, right? And needs, his soldiers to protect him, to protect the realm. He needs that warrior class. He also needs to delegate authority to people who are probably literate, intelligent, that he can trust, right? So the noble class is out there, right? These kinds of things. So there is that sort of reciprocity here. I help you, you help me kind of a thing. Yet at the same time, as I mentioned, anytime you delegate authority, you sort of put yourself in a difficult situation. And what Darius is really going to accomplish here is something kind of interesting, because he is able to reduce the political power of the aristocratic classes by controlling all appointments, which is to say, anyone who gains power, they have to come to me, comes through me, and they must, come back periodically and pledge loyalty again, and this kind of a thing, because he understands the challenges of this, right? Now, let me give you a couple counterexamples, just for the hell of it. Japan. In the year 1600, the Battle of Sekigahara, the Tokugawa shogunate will defeat the competition, shall we say, and become the dominant noble family in Japan. They will maintain the emperor, right? But sort of as a powerless figure, and it's really the shogun, the leader of this family, who indeed rules. And the noble class is in Japan called daimyos, and each daimyo is rated hierarchically according to the number of bushels of rice that can be harvested on the land that they own or control. And so if I have 400 koku and you have 200 koku, well, I'm twice as high in the hierarchy of nobility in Japan. So these are very, very proud people with their own private army of samurai swordsmen. And what the Tokugawa shogun does to do what Darius is trying to do, is he forces the daimyos to spend 1 year in the imperial capital at Edo, Tokyo, okay, and then the second year back in their home province. But when they return to their home province, they leave their wives and children with him. Why? Why would you do that? Well, of course, when you return to your home province, you can now gather up your own private army, stir up rebellion, go to the neighboring noble and say it's time to do it, right? This kind of thing. But of course, now you're in a situation where if you rise up against the shogun, you know what's going to happen. Your wife and children's heads will be on spikes decorating the walls outside Edo as an indication of what happens to anyone who revolts against the shogun. Again, powerful institutions created to ensure that when I delegate power or leave people in power, that they will not rebel against me. The second example is Louis XIV. Louis XIV is going to convert what was a hunting lounge in the countryside, 14 miles out of what was Paris at that point in time, into Versailles, right? A showcase, a magnificent showcase of royal splendor, in which he got the greatest artisans in the realm to come and create furniture and carpets and tapestries and amazing buildings. And amongst the buildings that he built were buildings designed to house the aristocracy who would come to visit him. And only if you came to visit him and paid homage on him could you then indeed be given, those grants of wealth and favor that the king could give to you. And it was his way of keeping an eye on people. Interesting. Put that together with some of the stuff we're seeing here, right? Now, Darius is, as I said, engaging in public works that are going to promote a sense of imperial identity. Large-scale road building, for example. The creation of what will be called the Royal Road that will extend from the inner reaches of Asia, as far as the empire goes, all the way out to the Mediterranean and then up north as well, right? And of course, it's a royal road that creates then dependable communication, because in this situation at this point in time, there are no telephones, there's nothing like that. It's horsemen on riders on horses, carrying messages from place to place, right? And indeed, they will create way stations copying what the Assyrians had done, so that there will be places where a rider can rest, get a new horse, eat, take off, go further, right? Spend a night, and then go further, right? But you can also use the roads then for the transport of trade and commerce, right? Tribute coming in from the outer areas of the empire into the center region, right? Soldiers, yeah. Okay. When the communication arrives that there's an outbreak of rebellion over here, the next thing you know, you've got soldiers marching in that direction, right? And given this marvelous road and systems of roads that takes you to all the major capitals out there, right? You can have troops there relatively quickly in the context of the time, right? Now, again, as pastoral nomads, they had no tradition of monumental architecture, nor do they have a tradition of visual arts or indeed written literature or history, right? So Darius will create the city of Persepolis. So there is the traditional old capital of Susa, but Darius will create Persepolis as a city designed specifically for celebration ceremonies, indeed ceremonies on a monumental scale. And will bring in artists and artisans to and architects to create a monumental organization. And there's a pretty good picture in the textbook and you see some of the sort of the use of sculpture, bas-reliefs, right, which are, you carve into and they stand out from the rock itself, and bas-reliefs that show, people carrying offerings and stuff like that, right? And they will also begin to develop histories and literature and things like that, right? This will be the great empire against which the Greek city-states will rise up against in rebellion, particularly because Cyrus the Great, in that first wave of conquest, will go out and conquer Greek city-states that are sort of on the western coast of Anatolia, so facing the Aegean Sea and the Greek islands and all of that. They will now be conquered by the Persians, and the Persians will request help. No, the Greeks in those cities will request help from their Greek brethren and ultimately lead to warfare between Athens, Sparta, the Greek city-states, and the Persian Empire. Ultimately, it will be a Greek monarch, Alexander the Great, who will, leading the army of Greeks, will overthrow and destroy the empire that was created by Darius in the year 330 and thereabout, a series of battles that occur, right? Okay, I'm going to leave this here, and hopefully you're not bothered by the fact that there are two separate pieces, but I'm not good enough to get the system to pick up and continue where I left off, and I didn't want to lose it because I'd already done it. I'm getting lazy. So let's see. Okay.